The dim glow of a single bulb flickered in the cramped back room of McGregor's, a seedy gambling den reeking of stale beer and desperation. The air was thick with cigar smoke, the murmurs of men hunched over poker tables blending into a low hum of tension. Delaney Hayes stood rigid in the corner, arms crossed tightly over her chest. The scent of sweat and whiskey clung to her stepfather, Wayne, as he slumped over the table, his bloodshot eyes locked onto the pile of chips in front of him, his last hope. She had watched him lose before, many times, but tonight was different. Wayne tossed his final set of chips onto the table with a shaky hand. Across from him sat Rowan Calloway, silent, unreadable. The man was a legend in Savannah's elite circles. He was ruthless in business, feared in power, and cold as the marble floors of his estate. He played like he had nothing to lose because, unlike Wayne, he never did. Wayne's hand was a disaster. A losing streak had never stopped him from gambling, but now he had nothing left to bet. Nothing but her. The words left his mouth in a slurred, desperate whisper. One last wager. The girl? Delaney's stomach dropped. No. Rowan's sharp gaze flicked to her. His expression didn't change, but something unreadable passed through his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, considering. The room was silent. She wanted to run, but her feet were frozen. Finally, Rowan lifted his glass, swirling the amber liquid inside. You're selling her? His tone was neutral, as if discussing a business transaction. Wayne nodded, avoiding Delaney's glare. Rowan took his time, setting his drink down, adjusting his cuffs. Then, with an air of finality, he slid his chips forward. Done? Delaney snapped out of her shock. I am not an object to be traded, she spat, her voice sharp despite the fear clawing at her chest. Rowan met her furious gaze. His voice was calm, but there was steel behind it. You are now mine? Delaney's hands clenched into fists. Her breath came in short bursts, her pulse hammering. She swallowed hard and stepped closer, lifting her chin. You might own me on paper, Calloway, but you will never own me. His smirk was slight, almost imperceptible. We'll see. And just like that, her fate was sealed. The ceremony was over in less than 20 minutes. Delaney stood at the altar in a silk dress she hadn't chosen, in a room filled with strangers who neither cared about her nor believed in this union. The vows were exchanged mechanically, Rowan's voice steady, controlled. She barely heard the officiant declare them husband and wife. Her mind was too numb, her body too rigid with defiance. Not a single guest smiled. There was no celebration, no warmth. Just expensive champagne flutes clinking together in a toast to a deal sealed, not a marriage made. As they walked down the marble aisle together, Rowan barely touched her, his grip on her arm as light as a whisper. The cameras flashed, capturing the moment for the world outside. One more illusion for the press, the socialites, the investors watching from afar. To them, it was just another calculated move by the Calloway empire. To Delaney, it was a sentence. The estate loomed before her like a fortress as they arrived. The high iron gates creaked shut behind them, and the car rolled to a stop in front of the grand entrance. Rowan stepped out first, adjusting his cufflinks, his expression unreadable. Delaney followed, her fingers instinctively tightening around the fabric of her dress. Inside, the house was cold, its beauty impersonal. A mansion meant to impress, not to be lived in. Rowan walked ahead without looking back. Your room is down the hall, he said flatly. We don't have to see much of each other. Delaney exhaled sharply. So, that's it? A performance for the world, and now we just exist under the same roof. Rowan finally turned to her, his gaze sharp. Did you expect romance? She held her chin high. I expected you to at least pretend I was a person. A muscle ticked in his jaw, but his voice remained controlled. You are a Calloway now, Delaney. That's all that matters. She stepped closer, meeting his cold eyes with burning defiance. You can put your name on me, but you will never own me. For the first time, something flickered behind his gaze. Something dangerous. We'll see, he murmured before turning away, leaving her alone in the vast, hollow house. Delaney had never seen a house like this. The Calloway estate was a sprawling labyrinth of polished marble floors, towering windows, and chandeliers that sparkled like caged stars. Everything was pristine, calculated, cold, much like its owner. She roamed the halls with slow, measured steps, her fingertips grazing the intricate carvings on the mahogany banisters. The silence was unsettling. No warmth, no laughter, no sign of a home. Only the weight of old money and a legacy built on power. She wasn't meant to feel comfortable here. At the end of a corridor, a door stood slightly ajar. Delaney hesitated before pushing it open, revealing a study lined with bookshelves stretching to the ceiling. The scent of aged paper and leather filled the air. She scanned the desk, her eyes narrowing at a locked drawer. Her instincts prickled. There were secrets here. She could feel them. "You shouldn't be in here." The voice was smooth yet firm. Delaney turned to find a woman standing in the doorway, arms crossed. Eloise Carter. She was in her early 50s, with sharp features softened only slightly by time. A woman who had seen things, known things. "I was just looking around," Delaney said, not bothering to feign innocence. Eloise studied her before stepping inside, her heels clicking against the polished floor. The Calloway house has rules. Certain doors remain closed for a reason. Delaney folded her arms. "And you make sure those doors stay shut?" A flicker of amusement crossed Eloise's face. "I ensure the household runs smoothly." She didn't answer the question. Before Delaney could push further, Eloise turned away. "Dinner is served at 7. Whether you choose to attend is up to you." And just like that, she was gone. Delaney exhaled, glancing at the locked drawer once more before stepping back into the corridor. Rowan hadn't spoken a word to her since they arrived. She saw him once in passing, his posture effortlessly composed as he scrolled through his phone. He didn't acknowledge her presence, didn't look up. Invisible. Fine. If he wanted to pretend she didn't exist, she'd play the game her way. Because Delaney knew one thing for certain. This house held secrets. And if Rowan thought she would simply accept her place in his world, he had underestimated her. Delaney had never been good at following rules, especially ones imposed on her. She refused to sit quietly in this mansion, playing the role of the obedient wife Rowan clearly expected. So, she did the only thing she could. She pushed back. It started subtly. At dinner, she sat at the far end of the table instead of the chair Eloise had set for her beside Rowan. He barely glanced up from his meal, but she caught the way his fingers briefly tensed around his fork. The next morning, she wandered the halls freely, ignoring the silent disapproval of the staff. She explored rooms without asking permission, opening doors that had been left ajar, lingering in places she suspected she wasn't supposed to be. She wanted to see how long it would take for Rowan to snap. It didn't take long. "You're testing me," Rowan said, his voice quiet but edged with something sharp. Delaney had just pushed open the doors to his office, fully aware she wasn't invited. She met his gaze without flinching. "I live here now, don't I? Thought I'd get to know my surroundings." Rowan leaned back in his chair, setting his phone aside. The room smelled of expensive cologne and old books, the air charged with unspoken tension. "You mistake my patience for tolerance." She tilted her head. "And you mistake my presence for submission." For the first time, something flickered in his expression, something almost amused. But it was gone just as quickly. He stood, rounding the desk slowly, his movements precise. "If you're looking for a fight, Delaney," he murmured, stopping inches from her, "you should know I don't lose." Her pulse kicked up, but she refused to step back. "Then you've never met someone willing to fight back." The room felt smaller, the space between them charged. Rowan's eyes traced over her face, his unreadable expression making it impossible to tell whether he was infuriated or intrigued. Before either of them could speak, a sharp knock at the door broke the moment. Rowan turned away without another word, dismissing her as if she weren't worth another second of his time. Delaney exhaled, turning back toward the desk. That's when she saw it. Half hidden beneath a stack of papers, a folder marked confidential. Curiosity burned through her, but she knew she wouldn't get another chance today. Still, her gut told her one thing. Rowan Calloway was hiding something, and she intended to find out what. Delaney barely had time to react before she heard the door click shut behind her. She froze. Rowan stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable, but the tension in his posture was unmistakable. His gaze flicked to the confidential folder she had barely touched before returning to her. Silence. Then, slowly, he stepped forward, the sound of his polished shoes against the hardwood floor the only noise in the room. "You're bold," he said, his voice low, measured. "I'll give you that." Delaney forced herself to stay still, to meet his gaze without flinching. "I was just looking." A shadow of a smirk touched his lips, but it was anything but kind. "And what exactly were you looking for?" She shrugged, feigning indifference. "Answers. You like keeping secrets." He exhaled a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "And you like crossing lines?" Rowan stepped closer, and for a moment, Delaney thought he might actually touch her. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned in just enough that she could feel the heat radiating off him, his presence suffocating yet intoxicating. "You're playing a dangerous game," he murmured. "And I don't think you realize what happens when you lose." Delaney's fingers curled into fists at her sides, but her voice remained steady. "I don't scare easily." That made him pause. His expression shifted slightly, just enough for her to notice. Something flickered in his eyes, something dark and assessing. He expected fear. He expected submission. She gave him neither. After a beat, Rowan exhaled slowly, as if composing himself. He took a step back, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "Stay out of my business, Delaney." She lifted a brow. "Or what?" His gaze was sharp, but this time, there was something else beneath it. A warning, a challenge. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, just when she thought he might say something more, he turned on his heel and walked away. The door shut behind him with quiet finality. Delaney let out a slow breath, her heart pounding. He wanted her to fear him, but all she felt was the rush of something else entirely. Something she couldn't quite name yet. The Calloway estate was filled with whispers, secrets woven into its walls like a tapestry of lies. Delaney had learned to listen. It was late when she wandered the halls, the chandeliers dimmed, casting elongated shadows over the marble floors. She wasn't sure what drew her to the West Wing, only that something in her gut told her she wasn't the only one awake. She was right. A hushed conversation drifted from a partially open door down the hall. "He's too reckless," a low male voice murmured. "It's only a matter of time before he makes a mistake." Delaney slowed her steps, pressing herself against the cool wall. Her pulse quickened. "Then we make sure he does," another voice answered, this one deeper, older, calm in a way that sent a chill through her. Harrison Calloway, Rowan's father. She swallowed, her fingers curling into the fabric of her dress. "He won't go down quietly," the first man said. "He doesn't trust anyone. Not even you." Harrison let out a dry chuckle. "Which is exactly why he won't see it coming." Silence stretched between them. Delaney's breath felt too loud, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. They were talking about Rowan. They wanted him gone. She knew Rowan was ruthless, cold, but this was different. This wasn't just business. This was betrayal. The floor creaked beneath her foot, and she stilled, heart lurching. The voices stopped. For a split second, she thought she'd been caught. Then Harrison spoke again, softer this time. "Patience. We wait for the right moment." Delaney didn't wait to hear more. She turned, moving quickly but silently down the hall, her mind racing. Back in her room, she paced, fists clenched. Rowan had enemies within his own family. Did he know? Did he suspect? Part of her wanted to ignore it, let him figure it out himself. But another part, the part that refused to be a pawn in a game she hadn't chosen to play, knew she couldn't. Because if Harrison succeeded, Rowan wouldn't be the only one affected. And Delaney refused to be collateral damage. Delaney refused to be just another pawn in the Calloway empire. If Rowan thought she would stay in the shadows, silent and obedient, he was about to be sorely disappointed. She started small. At breakfast, she arrived late, deliberately taking the seat at the head of the table, his seat. The staff froze, their eyes darting to Rowan as he entered the room. He barely hesitated before settling into a chair beside her, but Delaney caught the tension in his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. "You're making yourself comfortable," he said smoothly, pouring himself coffee. She lifted her cup with an easy smile. "Shouldn't I?" This is my home now, isn't it? Rowan said nothing, simply watching her with that unreadable gaze of his. But she saw the way his fingers tightened around the porcelain cup. Later that afternoon, she found him in the study, reviewing financial reports. Working hard, I see, she mused, stepping inside. Rowan didn't look up. Something you need? No, she trailed her fingers over the polished surface of the bookshelves. Just curious. Your family's business empire. It's impressive. Now he glanced up, one brow arched. I wasn't aware you had an interest in finance. She smiled. I have an interest in power. Rowan leaned back in his chair, studying her. And what do you know about power, Delaney? She met his gaze, her tone deceptively light. That it's only real if people believe you have it. His smirk was slow, dark. And what exactly are you trying to prove? She stepped closer, placing her hands on the edge of his desk. That you should start paying attention to me. For a long moment, Rowan said nothing. Then, without breaking eye contact, he pushed back his chair and stood. The space between them shrank in an instant. He reached past her, his fingertips just barely grazing her wrist as he closed the folder she had been eyeing. Careful, Delaney, he murmured. Curiosity can be dangerous. She refused to step back. So can underestimating someone. His expression flickered, something dark and intrigue passing through his gaze. Then, just as quickly, he stepped away. Enjoy your afternoon, he said, dismissing her like she was nothing more than a passing thought. But Delaney knew better. He noticed her now, and this game had only just begun. Delaney had never been one to back down from a fight, and neither, it seemed, was Rowan. The tension had been simmering for days, an invisible thread pulled too tight. The way he watched her but refused to acknowledge her, the way she pushed him just to see how far she could go. Tonight, that thread snapped. I don't know what game you think you're playing, Rowan said, his voice low, controlled. Delaney stood in front of him, arms crossed, chin lifted. Oh, I think you do. She had found him in the study again, the same room where every battle between them seemed to unfold. This time, she hadn't come to provoke him. She had come to demand answers. Answers about his father, about the whispers in the halls, about the war brewing under this roof. But Rowan, as always, deflected. You want to pretend this house isn't a battlefield? She continued, stepping closer. Fine, but don't expect me to play the silent wife while you wait to be stabbed in the back. His jaw tightened. Stay out of it. No. The single word hung between them, sharp as a blade. Rowan exhaled slowly, shaking his head. You think defying me makes you strong, but you don't understand the consequences. Delaney took another step until they were toe-to-toe. And you think pushing me away will keep you in control. Something in his eyes darkened. Delaney! But she wasn't done. You keep telling yourself you don't care. That this arrangement means nothing. That I mean nothing. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Say it, she whispered. His nostrils flared. Say it, Rowan. And then he was moving, so fast she barely had time to breathe. His hand caught her wrist, yanking her forward. His other hand cupped the back of her neck, and before she could react, his lips crashed against hers. It wasn't soft. It wasn't gentle. It was fire and fury. It was everything unspoken between them. All the tension, the defiance, the restraint they had both pretended to have. His grip was firm, almost desperate, as if punishing himself for wanting her. Delaney gasped against his mouth, her fingers digging into his shirt, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. And then, just as suddenly as he had kissed her, Rowan shoved her back. She stumbled, chest heaving, lips parted in shock. Rowan's breathing was uneven, his expression unreadable, but his hands trembled slightly, as if they weren't sure whether to reach for her again or push her further away. Leave, he said, voice raw. Delaney didn't move. Now. She studied him for a long moment, then smirked. You can lie to yourself, Calloway, she murmured, turning toward the door. But not to me. And with that, she walked away, leaving him standing there, furious, conflicted, and completely undone. The feeling started subtly, a prickling at the back of her neck, the sense of unseen eyes tracking her every move. At first, Delaney thought it was paranoia. But paranoia didn't explain the shadow she caught in her periphery when she wandered the halls. It didn't explain the sound of footsteps stopping just as she turned a corner. Someone was watching her, and she intended to find out who. It was near midnight when she saw Eloise Carter slipping through the hallway leading to the east wing. Delaney followed. She kept her steps light, pressing herself against the walls, careful to stay just out of sight. Eloise moved with purpose, her shoulders squared, her expression unreadable. The woman had always been composed, impossibly so, but now Delaney saw something else: secrecy. The house was silent, except for the faint creak of floorboards beneath their steps. Eloise turned a corner and disappeared into a room at the end of the hall. Delaney hesitated for only a second before creeping forward, pressing her ear to the heavy wooden door. "Assume he doesn't know," a man's voice murmured. A pause. Then Eloise's voice, quiet but firm. "Rowan isn't the fool his father thinks he is." Delaney's breath hitched. She didn't recognize the man's voice, but Harrison Calloway's name lingered between them like a loaded gun. Inside, the conversation continued, muffled but urgent. "You made your choice, Eloise. No turning back." Silence. Then, after a long pause, she spoke again. "I always knew this day would come." Delaney clenched her jaw. Eloise knew something. She was involved in whatever Harrison was plotting, but how deep did her loyalty run? Was she an informant? A threat? The door creaked slightly, and Delaney scrambled back, pressing herself into the shadows just as Eloise stepped out. The older woman paused, her sharp gaze scanning the hall. Delaney held her breath. After a moment, Eloise exhaled and disappeared down the corridor, her expression unreadable. Delaney's pulse pounded. There was more at play here than she had realized. And if Eloise was involved, it meant one thing. She wasn't just fighting against Rowan's father. She was surrounded by enemies. Delaney had never been one to ask for help, so when she stumbled back into the mansion, her palm pressed against the fresh cut along her forearm. She had no intention of seeking Rowan. But he found her first. She barely made it past the grand staircase when his voice sliced through the silence. "You're bleeding?" She stiffened, turning to see Rowan standing in the dim light of the foyer, his sharp gaze locked on the crimson staining her skin. His usual mask of indifference wavered for just a second, long enough for her to catch the flicker of something else. Concern. Delaney forced a smirk. "It's just a scratch." Rowan didn't respond. He closed the distance between them in 3 measured steps, his hand closing around her wrist before she could pull away. She should have resisted, should have snapped at him for touching her. But she didn't. He led her to his study, where the air was thick with the scent of leather and aged whiskey. She sat stiffly on the couch while he retrieved a first aid kit, his movements methodical, efficient. "This isn't from an accident," Rowan said, kneeling in front of her. His tone was quiet but edged with certainty. Delaney exhaled slowly. "I tripped." He glanced up, arching a brow. "Try again." She held his gaze, debating whether to lie. But something in his expression made her hesitate. "It doesn't matter," she muttered. Rowan didn't push. He simply took her arm and began cleaning the wound. His touch was firm but careful, his fingers warm against her skin. Delaney had expected him to be cold, distant. He always was. But not now. Not in this moment. "You're too reckless," he murmured, dabbing the cut with antiseptic. She huffed out a laugh. "You want to talk?" His lips twitched just barely. "I never said I wasn't." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Then quietly, Rowan said, "I know what it's like to be surrounded by people you can't trust." Delaney stilled. He wasn't looking at her anymore, his focus on wrapping the bandage around her arm. But there was something in his voice, something raw, unguarded. "I learned early that loyalty is conditional," he continued. "That even the people closest to you will turn the second it benefits them." Her chest tightened. She had seen glimpses of his world, of the sharp edges hidden beneath his composed exterior. But this was different. This was a confession. Rowan finished securing the bandage, his touch lingering for just a second longer than necessary. Then he met her eyes, something unreadable in his gaze. Delaney swallowed. For the first time, she saw him. Not the ruthless businessman, not the man who had bought her. Just Rowan. and it terrified her. Delaney had never been afraid of silence. Silence was safer than words. Words could be weapons, twisted and used against you. But tonight, sitting across from Rowan in the dimly lit study, the silence between them felt different. Not empty, not cold, just waiting. It had started with a simple exchange. Rowan pouring himself a drink after another long day. Delaney lingering by the window, staring at the moonlit gardens outside. She should have walked away. She usually did, but something kept her rooted in place. "Sit," Rowan said eventually, surprising them both. Delaney hesitated, then, without a word, settled into the chair opposite him. She watched as he swirled the amber liquid in his glass, his gaze distant. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. Rowan lifted a brow. "Regret what?" "This life. The name. The power." She tilted her head. "The weight of it." His fingers tightened around his glass. "Regret is useless." "That's not an answer." A flicker of something crossed his face. Amusement? Annoyance? She could never tell with him. He exhaled through his nose, then leaned back in his chair. "I didn't have a choice. This," he gestured vaguely around the room, "was decided for me before I even understood what choice was." Delaney studied him, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her own untouched glass. For weeks, she had seen him as nothing more than a prison warden. The man who had bought her claimed her as if she were just another business deal. But that wasn't the whole picture, was it? "You could still walk away," she murmured. Rowan let out a quiet laugh, one that didn't reach his eyes. "And go where?" Delaney knew that feeling all too well. The suffocating realization that no matter where you ran, you never truly escaped. She didn't know why, but she said, "Maybe nowhere is better than here." For the first time, Rowan looked at her not with calculation, not with irritation, but with something softer. "Would you leave if you could?" His voice was quieter now. Delaney's throat tightened. She wanted to say yes, that she would flee this house, this life but she didn't, because some twisted part of her wasn't so sure anymore. Instead, she looked away. "It doesn't matter." Rowan didn't push. They sat there for a long time, neither speaking, neither moving. The distance between them had never felt smaller, yet more dangerous. Eventually, Rowan reached for the decanter again, refilling his glass. He poured another beside it, then nudged it toward her. A silent offering. Delaney hesitated, then picked it up. Neither of them smiled. Neither of them acknowledged what had shifted. But as the night stretched on, neither of them left, either. The Calloway estate had many secrets. Delaney had known that from the moment she set foot inside its grand, suffocating halls. But nothing could have prepared her for this. It was late when she found herself in Rowan's study again. He wasn't there, and she hadn't planned on lingering. But something nagged at her. The room had always felt like a puzzle. Every drawer a locked mystery. Every document a carefully placed barrier between the truth and the world. And Delaney was tired of waiting for answers. She moved quickly, scanning the desk, the bookshelves, the hidden compartments she had learned to recognize in places like this. Then, tucked beneath a pile of financial records, she found it. A thin folder, its edges worn as if it had been opened and closed too many times. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped it open. At first, it seemed like nothing, a birth certificate, a few scattered legal documents. But as she scanned the lines, the words began to blur, rearranging themselves into a horrifying truth. Rowan Calloway was not a Calloway at all. Delaney's breath hitched. They're right there in black and white. His real name, his real past. He hadn't been born into this legacy. He had been chosen, placed, bought. Her fingers curled around the paper. Harrison Calloway had replaced his own heir. But why? Her mind raced through the possibilities. The real Calloway heir. What had happened to him? Was he dead? Hidden away? And why had Rowan been the one chosen to take his place? She didn't hear the door open, but she felt him. Rowan's presence filled the room like a storm, suffocating, electric. "What the hell are you doing?" Delaney turned slowly, the documents still clutched in her hands. She expected rage, fury. Instead, Rowan's face was eerily blank, his expression unreadable. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. It's true, isn't it? His jaw tightened. Rowan, she pressed. Who are you? Silence. Then finally he spoke. I'm no one. The quiet confession sent a shiver through her. For the first time, Rowan Calloway looked like a man without armor. A man who had spent his entire life being something he wasn't. A man who had just realized she knew his greatest secret. The silence between them stretched too long. Delaney held the document like it was something fragile, something dangerous. And in a way it was. Rowan hadn't moved, but his eyes, dark and unreadable, told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't angry. Not yet. He was waiting for her to say something that would confirm his worst fear. Delaney took a slow breath. I didn't go looking for this. His jaw tensed. But you found it. I wasn't. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. I wasn't trying to hurt you, Rowan. A cold, humorless laugh escaped him. And yet, here we are. She took a step closer. He took a step back. That stung more than it should have. I don't care about your name, she said quietly. I don't care where you came from. But I do care about the fact that your father. His voice was sharp as a blade. Don't. Delaney swallowed. He didn't want to hear it. Didn't want to face the truth she now knew. Rowan turned abruptly, running a hand through his hair, his composure unraveling at the edges. When he finally spoke again, his tone had changed, calm, detached, final. You shouldn't have come here. The words sent a chill down her spine. Delaney's fingers curled around the paper. I'm not your enemy. Rowan met her gaze, and for the first time since she had met him, he looked at her like she was a stranger. You think I believe that? His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it, something sharp, something broken. You think I don't know what happens next? Delaney's throat tightened. Rowan, I trusted you. He cut in, his words laced with something too bitter to be anger. I let you close. And that was the worst part. Because Rowan Calloway didn't let people close. And now he regretted it. The storm had finally broken. The rage she had expected earlier came crashing down all at once. Get out, he said, voice low and lethal. Delaney's pulse pounded. No. His lips curled, but there was no amusement. You don't get to say no. A sharp knock echoed from the doorway. Eloise. Rowan didn't even look at her. See her out, he ordered, his tone cutting. Delaney's chest tightened. This wasn't just about the secret. This was about trust. And in Rowan Calloway's world, once trust was broken, there was no coming back. Delaney had spent her life learning when to fight and when to walk away. And this time, she walked away. Rowan had made it clear. She was no longer welcome. His anger had been cold, his words sharp as a blade. He had ordered her out as if she had never meant anything, as if she were nothing more than a mistake. So she packed her things. Not that she had much to take. Eloise had watched from the doorway, arms crossed, expression unreadable. This is what you wanted, isn't it? Delaney asked, zipping her bag shut. Eloise didn't answer right away. Then, with a quiet sigh, she said, It doesn't matter what I want. Delaney frowned. You don't have to be loyal to him. Eloise's lips pressed into a thin line. Maybe not, but that doesn't mean I'm loyal to you either. The word stung. Delaney slung the bag over her shoulder, her chest tight. She had no plan, no destination, but she wasn't going to stay where she wasn't wanted. She wouldn't beg. She wouldn't look back. Or at least, that had been the plan. She barely made it past the estate gates before she realized something was wrong. The night air was thick, humid, the distant hum of insects the only sound. Savannah had a way of feeling empty at night, the streets stretching too long, the shadows too deep. Delaney adjusted the strap of her bag and kept walking. Then, footsteps. She tensed. Not the cautious kind, not a passerby. These were deliberate, following hers in perfect rhythm. She quickened her pace. The footsteps matched. Her heart kicked against her ribs. Not paranoia. Real. Then, a hand clamped over her mouth. She thrashed, kicking, her bag slipping from her shoulder. Strong arms locked around her, dragging her back into the shadows. Harrison sends his regards, a voice murmured against her ear. Panic flared like a match strike. Delaney bit down hard. Her captor cursed. the grip on her loosening just enough. She twisted, elbowing him in the ribs, but there were more hands, more weight pressing down on her. Too many. The night blurred. She fought. God, she fought. But she wasn't strong enough. Not against this. And then, blackness. Rowan knew something was wrong before he even saw the empty room. The house was too quiet. The staff avoided his gaze. A sharp pang hit his chest, something unnamed, something unwelcome. She was gone. He should have felt relief. Should have been glad that she had finally walked out, that he had gotten exactly what he wanted. Then why did it feel like a mistake? He exhaled slowly, forcing the thought down. It didn't matter. She was gone. And then, Eloise appeared in the doorway. He barely looked at her. If you're here to say, I told you so. She didn't leave, Eloise interrupted. Rowan stilled. Cold. Sharp. Alert. What? She's gone, Eloise said carefully, but not by choice. Something dark and violent slammed through him. Rowan was moving before she finished speaking. The moment he saw the gate security footage, his blood turned to ice. She had been taken. His father's men. Rowan's grip tightened around the edge of the desk, his knuckles turning white. For weeks, he had told himself that Delaney was just another complication, that she was nothing more than an unwanted burden, a mistake he should have walked away from the moment she entered his life. But now, watching that grainy footage, her struggling, her vanishing into the night, Rowan knew one thing with absolute, undeniable certainty. He could not lose her. And if Harrison thought he could take Delaney from him, then he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Rowan had always been controlled, calculated. But tonight he felt none of that. All he felt was rage. Delaney was gone, taken. And the man responsible was the one person who had spent his life pulling the strings, Harrison Calloway. Rowan's father had made many mistakes. This would be his last. The warehouse was on the outskirts of Savannah, tucked away behind rusted train tracks and overgrown lots. Rowan arrived alone, ignoring the warnings of his men. He didn't trust anyone with this. Delaney had been taken because of him. He would be the one to get her back. He moved like a shadow, slipping past the perimeter. 2 guards patrolled outside, sloppy, careless. Rowan took them down with practiced ease, silent and efficient. Then he stepped inside. The air smelled of damp, wood, and oil. Dim lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the walls. And there she was, Delaney, tied to a chair, her wrists bound, her lips split. But her gaze was still defiant. Relief crashed through him so violently it almost knocked him off balance. Her eyes widened when she saw him, disbelief flickering over her face before she masked it with that same stubborn resilience he had come to expect. You're late, she muttered. Rowan almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he pulled out his knife and sliced through the ropes binding her wrists. The second she was free, she was in his arms. She didn't hesitate, didn't think, just moved, pressing herself against him like she wasn't sure if he was real. Rowan's fingers curled into her back, holding her tighter than he should. You okay? His voice was rough, unsteady. Delaney nodded against his chest. I've had worse. He pulled back just enough to cup her face, his thumb grazing her bruised cheek. Something sharp twisted inside him. I almost lost you, he murmured. She swallowed hard, her hands still fisted in his shirt. You didn't? Rowan's jaw clenched. But I could have. His father had used her to send a message, to remind Rowan that no one in his life was untouchable. Rowan wasn't a man who made reckless choices. But for her, he would burn everything down. Delaney studied him, something unreadable in her expression. Rowan, his fingers tightened. You're mine, Delaney. The words were a promise, a confession, a warning. And I don't lose what's mine. She didn't pull away, didn't fight him. She just whispered, then don't let me go. The adrenaline had worn off, but the tension between them had not. Rowan brought Delaney back to the estate, but instead of sending her to her room, he took her to his. She didn't protest. She should have. But after everything, the betrayal, the separation, the fear of losing him, Delaney didn't want to be alone tonight. Neither did he. The room was dimly lit, the air thick with something unspoken. Rowan stood near the fireplace, his back to her, his posture tense. His white dress shirt was wrinkled from the night's events, the top buttons undone. He looked undone, like a man barely keeping himself together. Delaney swallowed. "Say something." He exhaled, shaking his head. "I almost lost you." "You didn't." He turned then, his gaze sharp, full of something dangerous. Something she had never seen in him before. "Do you have any idea what that did to me?" His voice was quiet, but there was no mistaking the emotion beneath it. Delaney's chest tightened. She had spent so long fighting him, pushing him, refusing to be controlled. But this wasn't about control. This was about them. "I was never going to let them take me from you," she murmured. Rowan's expression darkened. "You shouldn't have had to fight." She took a slow step forward, closing the space between them. "But I did, and I would again." His fingers twitched at his sides, as if restraining himself. Delaney reached out, her hand brushing against his. That was all it took. Rowan moved fast, closing the distance in an instant. His hand came up, fingers threading through her hair as he pulled her closer, his breath hot against her skin. "This isn't a game, Delaney." His voice was rough, edged with warning. If we do this, there's no turning back." She looked up at him, her pulse hammering. "I don't want to turn back." Something in him snapped. The moment their lips met, it was fire, desperate, consuming, inevitable. There was no more fighting, no more pushing each other away. Just heat, need, the weight of everything they had been denying for too long. Rowan lifted her effortlessly, carrying her to the bed without breaking the kiss. Delaney's fingers curled into his shirt, pulling him down with her, not willing to let go. Not now. Not ever. Tonight, there were no more barriers. No more fear. No more pretending. Tonight she chose him. The morning light filtered through the heavy curtains, casting golden streaks across the room. But neither Delaney nor Rowan had slept. The warmth between them from the night before had not faded, but reality had settled in. Harrison wasn't done, and now neither were they. Rowan stood near the window, his shoulders tense, his phone gripped in his hand. The air around him crackled with restrained fury. Delaney watched him carefully from where she sat on the edge of the bed. "What did you find out?" Rowan exhaled slowly, his jaw clenched tight. "He's moving faster than I expected." He turned, his expression unreadable. "Harrison has arranged a meeting with the board. He's going to expose everything. My past, my real identity, every weakness he thinks I have." Delaney's stomach tightened. Rowan wasn't just at risk of losing his company. He was at risk of losing everything. She stood, crossing the room until she was in front of him. "Then we stop him." His dark gaze met hers. "How?" She lifted a brow. "Not by walking into his trap." Rowan's expression hardened. "I could end this right now." She knew what he meant. His father had spent years manipulating, controlling, and now betraying him. Rowan wanted revenge, real, permanent revenge. But that wasn't the way to win. Not this time. Delaney placed a hand on his chest, feeling the tension beneath her palm. "You're thinking like him." Rowan's nostrils flared, but he didn't move. "If you strike first, you'll prove him right," she said softly. "He wants you to act on emotion. He wants you reckless." Rowan let out a bitter laugh. "You think I should sit back and do nothing?" "No." Delaney stepped closer. "I think we should be smarter." Rowan studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark with conflict. Then finally he exhaled. "What's your plan?" A slow smirk curled at her lips. "We expose him first?" She could see the shift in Rowan immediately, the way his muscles relaxed just enough, the way his focus sharpened. Delaney knew secrets. And Harrison Calloway? He had plenty. Rowan reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Not a demand, not control, a silent agreement. "We do this your way," he murmured. "But if he makes a move..." Delaney nodded. "Then we destroy him." For the first time, they weren't fighting each other. They were fighting together. The Calloway Gala was a spectacle, a carefully curated illusion of power, wealth, and control. Tonight, however, it was a battlefield. Delaney and Rowan entered the grand ballroom side by side, their movements synchronized, their expressions unreadable. They were ready. Harrison Calloway stood at the center of it all, his polished charm in full force as he greeted guests, shaking hands with men who didn't know they were about to witness his downfall. The speech came at precisely 9 o'clock. Harrison stepped onto the stage, the golden chandeliers casting an eerie glow over him. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rich with false sincerity, "tonight is not only a celebration, but a moment of clarity, of truth." Rowan stiffened beside Delaney, but she placed a steadying hand on his arm. "Wait," Harrison continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "For years, the Calloway legacy has been built on strength, honor, and integrity. But there are those among us who have tainted that legacy." His smile was razor-sharp as he turned his attention to Rowan. "People who have no rightful claim to the name they bear." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Rowan's fingers curled into fists. Delaney exhaled slowly. It was time. She stepped forward before Rowan could, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "That's a powerful speech, Mr. Calloway," she said, her tone deceptively calm. "But if we're talking about fraud, perhaps we should discuss yours." The room froze. Harrison's smile faltered. "Excuse me?" Delaney smiled sweetly. "Oh, I think you heard me." She pulled a small envelope from her clutch, her fingers steady as she held it up. "These are copies of falsified documents. Documents that show how you tampered with company records to claim power that was never yours." Gasps echoed through the room. Harrison's expression darkened, but Delaney pressed forward. "You were never grooming Rowan to lead," she continued, her voice sharp. "You were setting him up to fall." Rowan stepped beside her then, his presence a quiet but undeniable force. For the first time, Harrison looked rattled. Delaney turned to the crowd, letting the moment sink in. "So, tell me," she said, lifting a brow, "who's the real fraud here?" Silence. Then a shift. The power in the room tilted, the weight of the truth crushing Harrison's control in real time. Rowan met his father's gaze, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't standing in Harrison Calloway's shadow. Tonight he was free. The gala was over. The facade of the Calloway empire had shattered. But Harrison Calloway was not a man who accepted defeat quietly. Rowan had expected this. As the guests murmured in disbelief, as investors pulled away in quiet whispers, Harrison didn't panic. He simply straightened his tie, adjusted his cuffs, and smiled, as if this was nothing more than an inconvenience. Rowan knew better. "You think this changes anything?" Harrison's voice was low, laced with quiet amusement as he stepped closer. Rowan didn't move. He didn't flinch. He didn't fall into the trap. "It changes everything," Rowan said, his tone calm but absolute. Harrison exhaled, shaking his head. "You've always been so emotional. It's disappointing." He paused, then chuckled. "You wouldn't even be standing here if it weren't for me." Delaney stiffened beside Rowan, but he reached for her hand, his grip steady. Grounding. Harrison's gaze flickered toward Delaney, calculating. "Ah," he mused. "Of course. She's the reason, isn't she?" Rowan's jaw tightened. Harrison smiled wider. "You're smarter than this, son." "Stop calling me that," Rowan said. The words weren't loud, but they were final. Harrison's smile faltered. Rowan took a slow step forward, towering over the man who had once controlled his every move. "You used me. You tried to break me. But you don't owe me anymore." Harrison's lips pressed into a thin line. "You think you can cut me out?" Rowan exhaled, tilting his head slightly. "I know I can." For the first time, Harrison Calloway looked truly powerless. The weight of the moment settled in. The realization that Rowan, his creation, his replacement, his carefully crafted successor, was walking away. No more control. No more games. No more power over him. Harrison clenched his jaw. "You'll regret this." Rowan smirked. "Not as much as you will." And just like that, he turned his back on Harrison Calloway for good. The night air was crisp against Rowan's skin as they stepped outside. Delaney was quiet. She had been his anchor in that room, standing beside him, proving, again, that he wasn't alone in this. But now, she looked uncertain. "You did it," she murmured. Rowan turned to her. "We did it." She huffed a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "So what now?" He exhaled slowly, then looked at her the way he never let himself before. Like she wasn't just a complication. Like she wasn't just a fight he had lost control of. Like she was his choice. Stay, he said softly. Not because you have to, because you want to. Delaney held his gaze, her expression unreadable. Then slowly, carefully, she reached for his hand and held on. The Calloway Empire had fallen. The weight of Rowan's past, of the lies that had shaped his entire existence, had finally been lifted. For the first time in his life, he was free. But as he stood in the cool night air, his hands still wrapped around Delaney's, Rowan realized something. Freedom meant nothing without her. They didn't go back inside. Instead, they walked in silence through the gardens, the world around them hushed except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. The tension from the night had settled, leaving behind something heavier, something unspoken. Delaney hadn't let go of his hand. She had every reason to, every opportunity. Yet, she held on. Rowan cleared his throat, glancing at her. You didn't answer me. She looked up, brow furrowing. About what? He exhaled slowly. About staying? A flicker of something crossed her face. Uncertainty. Caution. But beneath it, something softer. She didn't run. She didn't deflect. Instead, she turned to him fully. I don't know how to be someone's choice, Rowan. Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant. I've spent my life being traded, being someone's burden, obligation, leverage. Rowan's chest tightened. He knew that feeling all too well. Then let me make it simple. His voice was steady, certain in a way he had never been before. And before she could say another word, he dropped to one knee. Delaney froze. The breath hitched in her throat, her eyes widening. What are you doing? Rowan smirked, but his usual arrogance was gone. This wasn't a game. This was real. I asked you once before, he murmured, and I did it for all the wrong reasons. Delaney swallowed hard, her fingers trembling at her sides. But this time, he continued, his gaze locked on hers. I'm not asking because I need to. I'm not asking because of some contract, some debt, some expectation. He exhaled, the words leaving him raw, unguarded. I'm asking because I love you. A shaky breath escaped her lips. He had never said it before. Not once. But it had always been there. In the way he fought for her, in the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching, in the way he had risked everything to bring her back. Rowan reached for her hand, pressing his lips to her knuckles. Stay with me. Not because you have nowhere else to go. Not because I need you to. But because you want to. Delaney's heart pounded so loudly, she could barely hear anything else. She had spent so long running. But right now, standing in front of Rowan, asterisk, this man who had been both her captor and her salvation. Asterisk, she didn't want to run anymore. So she did the only thing that made sense. She dropped to her knees in front of him. Rowan's breath caught as she cupped his face, her thumb tracing over his cheek. He was trembling. I want as she whispered. I want you. Rowan surged forward, crushing his lips against hers, pouring everything into that kiss. Every battle, every moment of defiance, every unsaid word. Delaney kissed him back just as fiercely, fingers tangling in his hair, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. For the first time, there were no walls between them, just them, and for once in both their lives, they had finally chosen each other. Rowan Calloway had spent his entire life living under his father's shadow. But that era was over. The fallout from the gala had been swift and brutal. Harrison Calloway had lost everything, the power, the respect, the name he had built his empire upon. Rowan had expected him to fight back, to claw for control like he always had. Instead, his father had disappeared into silence. Good, because Rowan had no intention of looking back. His first day at the company as its true leader felt different. There were no whispered doubts, no looming threats, no father waiting to pull the strings. This was his now, and he would run it on his own terms. The boardroom was quiet as he took his seat at the head of the long table. The men and women around him watched carefully, waiting to see what kind of leader he would be without Harrison's influence. Rowan steepled his fingers, letting the silence stretch before speaking. There will be changes. His tone was firm, unwavering. From this moment on, Calloway Industries operates under one rule. Loyalty is earned, not bought. Some of the older board members shifted uncomfortably, but no one argued. Rowan smirked. They knew. The game had changed, and he was the one making the rules now. Delaney was waiting for him at home. It wasn't something they had talked about, not exactly. She had been given a choice, a real one, for the first time in her life. She could leave. She could take the money, the power, the freedom, and walk away without a single chain tying her to him. But she hadn't. She was in the library when he found her, curled up in one of the armchairs, a book resting open on her lap. She looked up when he entered, tilting her head slightly. "Well," Rowan leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. "It's done." Her lips curled at the corners. "You don't sound excited." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't think it would feel so final." Delaney studied him for a moment before closing her book. She set it aside and stood, crossing the room until she was in front of him. "You're free, Rowan," she said softly. He reached out, tracing a finger along her wrist before tangling his fingers with hers. "So are you?" She smiled then, small but real. "And yet, I'm still here." Rowan tightened his grip on her hand, pulling her just a little closer. She had chosen to stay, and this time so had he. The drive back felt surreal. Rowan's hands gripped the wheel, his gaze steady on the road ahead, but Delaney could see the tension in his jaw. He hadn't spoken much since they left the estate, and for once, she didn't press him. She understood. They were going back to the place where everything had started, where he had bought her, where she had sworn he would never own her. And yet here they were, together by choice. McGregor's looked the same dim glow of the neon sign, the same smell of whiskey and regret lingering in the air, the same broken souls slumped over poker tables, gambling with money they didn't have. It was as if time had never moved here. But they had. Delaney stepped out of the car, folding her arms as she stared at the entrance. "Feels like a lifetime ago." Rowan shut the door behind him, shoving his hands into his pockets. "It was..." She glanced at him. "Then why are we here?" He exhaled, scanning the place. "Because I needed to see it." One last time, Delaney knew what he meant. This place had been a cage for both of them, in different ways. Rowan had thought he could buy control, that money and power could shape his fate. And she had thought she was destined to be traded, never given a choice. Neither of them had been right. Rowan turned to her then, his expression unreadable. "If I could go back," he trailed off, shaking his head. Delaney stepped closer. "You wouldn't?" His gaze snapped to hers. "You wouldn't change it," she said, voice softer now. "Because if you did, we wouldn't be standing here." Rowan's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "I don't deserve this," he murmured. Delaney smiled faintly. "Neither do I." They had both been broken, shaped by things they never chose. But together, they had built something new, a future neither of them thought they could have. Rowan's grip on her tightened. "Let's go." Delaney arched a brow. "That's it? No dramatic farewell?" Rowan smirked. "I think we've had enough dramatics for a lifetime." She laughed, squeezing his hand before they turned away from the past and walked toward whatever came next. The night was quiet. The sky stretched wide above them, speckled with stars. The world had slowed, leaving just the two of them on the terrace of the Calloway estate. For the first time, there were no battles left to fight. No secrets. No threats. Just them. Delaney leaned against the railing, the soft breeze lifting strands of her hair. Rowan stood beside her, his hand resting lightly against her back, not as a claim, not as control, just presence. "You're thinking too much," Rowan murmured, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. She glanced at him, smiling faintly. "I'm thinking about how strange this feels." His brow lifted. "Strange?" Delaney exhaled, turning toward him, not having to be on guard, not waiting for the next fight. Rowan's expression flickered with something she couldn't quite name. Then, after a beat, he reached for her hand, pulling her into his arms. Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't resist. She didn't even think about resisting. Rowan pressed his forehead against hers, his fingers tracing slow, absent-minded circles along the small of her back. "We don't have to fight anymore," he murmured. Delaney swallowed. "I don't know how not to." His lips brushed against her temple. Then we learned together. She closed her eyes, letting herself sink into the warmth of him. For so long, their touch had been about power, about defiance, about testing each other's limits. But this was different. Rowan wasn't demanding anything from her. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid to give. Her fingers curled into his shirt, grounding herself. "You love me," she whispered, half teasing, half breathless. Rowan let out a quiet laugh. "I do." She pulled back just enough to meet his gaze, her heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "Say it again." His lips twitched, his hands tightening around her waist. "I love you, Delaney Hayes." The words sent warmth curling through her chest, chasing away every old wound, every ghost of the past. She cupped his face, her thumb brushing along his jaw. "Good," she murmured, tilting her head up. "Because I love you too." Rowan didn't wait. He kissed her then, slow and deep, no urgency, no desperation, just certainty. Just forever. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of fresh rain and earth as the sun stretched over the Calloway estate. For the first time in a long time, everything felt still. No battles left to fight. No shadows looming over them. Just a new beginning. Delaney sat on the steps of the back terrace, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders as she watched the sky shift from soft pinks to golden hues. She had never been one to enjoy the quiet. Silence had always meant waiting for the next disaster. But this silence wasn't a warning. It was peace. A door creaked open behind her, followed by slow, steady footsteps. Then warmth. Rowan draped his jacket over her shoulders before settling beside her, his presence grounding. His hand brushed against hers as he sat, fingers curling around hers, a simple, instinctive movement. She turned to him, arching a brow. "You're up early?" He smirked, the corner of his lips lifting in that familiar way. "I could say the same about you." Delaney huffed, rolling her eyes. "Old habits." Rowan studied her for a moment, his expression softer than she'd ever seen it. "You don't have to wait for the worst anymore." Her fingers tightened slightly around his. "Neither do you." For a long time, neither of them spoke. There was no need to, because they had already won. Not the way they had thought, not through force, not through revenge, not through destruction. They had won by surviving, by choosing each other. "I've been thinking," Rowan said eventually, his thumb brushing absent-mindedly over her knuckles. Delaney tilted her head. "Dangerous habit." He smirked but didn't take the bait. Instead, he exhaled, glancing toward the horizon. "We could leave." She blinked. "What?" He turned back to her, expression unreadable. "This house, this city, it's built on everything that tried to break us." His voice was quiet, careful. "We don't owe it anything." Delaney swallowed. Leave. For so long. That had been the only thing she had ever wanted. To escape. To start over. But now, when she looked at Rowan, when she felt the steady weight of his hand in hers, she realized she didn't need to run anymore. "Do you want to leave?" she asked. Rowan's jaw tightened slightly. "I want a life with you. I don't care where it is." Her chest tightened, warmth blooming beneath her ribs. She shifted closer, looping her arms around his neck, letting her fingers tangle in his hair. "You're my life now," she murmured. "Wherever we are, that's home." Rowan exhaled slowly, resting his forehead against hers. "You really mean that?" Delaney smiled, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "I wouldn't still be here if I didn't." Something in him broke then, not in the way he had broken before, not in anger or grief. This time, he broke open, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid. Rowan cupped her face, tilting her chin up, his gaze locked onto hers. "Marry me?" Delaney huffed a soft laugh. "You already asked me that." His lips curled slightly. "Say yes again." She rolled her eyes, but didn't hesitate. "Yes." Then, before she could say anything else, he kissed her. A kiss that wasn't about ownership or power or winning. A kiss that meant everything. And as the sun rose higher, their future began. Together.